Welcome back. Top leaders of Afghanistan's Taliban met on Wednesday to discuss how to respond to a U.S. drone strike in Kabul that the United States says killed an al-Qaeda leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri. The United States killed Zawahiri with a missile fired from a drone while he stood on a balcony at his Kabul hideout on Sunday.
How does a government target an elusive militant leader? In the case of al-Qaeda chief Ayman al-Zawahiri, killed by the U.S. government over the weekend, it's through careful, patient, and persistent work by counterterrorism and intelligence agencies, according to a senior administration official. Zawahiri's death, the biggest blow to al-Qaeda since the U.S. killed its founder Osama bin Laden in 2011, came after he had been in hiding for years, rumored to have been in Pakistan's tribal area or inside Afghanistan. Speaking on condition of anonymity, the official laid out the details, starting with how the U.S. government had been aware of a network that supported Zawahiri. Over the past year, following the U.S.'s withdrawal from Afghanistan, officials had been watching for indications of al-Qaeda's presence in the country. This year, they confirmed that Zawahiri's family, his wife, his daughter, and her children, had relocated to a safe house in Kabul. Zawahiri was later identified at the same location. Once at the safe house, Zawahiri stayed put and was identified multiple times on the balcony of the house. By April, President Joe Biden was briefed by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. On July 1st, after weeks of meetings, the president and his top advisors, including CIA Director William Burns, convened in the White House Situation Room, where Biden was presented with a plan to take out Zawahiri. Senior interagency lawyers confirmed that Zawahiri was a lawful target based on his continuing leadership of al-Qaeda. On July 25th, Biden was given a final briefing. The president then authorized a precise, tailored airstrike on the condition that it minimized the risk of civilian casualties. The strike was carried out at 9:48 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or 1:48 GMT on July 30th by a drone firing so-called Hellfire missiles, striking Zawahiri where he had often been spotted, on the balcony of his safe house.
DesRoches is a professor at the National Defense University and former NATO Operations Director at the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He joins us now to talk about this situation. So just your thoughts on what the meeting would have been around in Afghanistan, particularly to do with this killing. Would it be around whether to respond or not? Would that even be on the table?
I think that there's a couple of possibilities. One possibility is that the Taliban is in fact uniform and is embarrassed by this, but views it as an assault on the sovereignty of their movement, in which case they will respond. I think a second, probably more likely scenario is that there are divisions within the Taliban, which has always been sort of an informal collection, really a tribal overlay that's sort of held together loosely by a shared dislike of, well, basically us. Given that they've achieved most of their goals, the leaders of the movement go their own way, and that Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is powerful and generally does his own thing regardless of what Taliban leadership says, he was the guy who was harboring al-Zawahiri. So there might be an argument among them about, why is this happening? And, how dare you expose us to this attack by, basically violating the Doha protocols. So we don't know which scenario happened, but I think both are equally likely. And my natural default is to go with the bureaucratic disorganization explanation rather than the unified evil explanation.
So would you share the sentiment by the State Department that there is a higher potential for anti-American violence, particularly following this killing?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Even though al-Qaeda has really declined as a centralized organization that directs its subordinates. The al-Qaeda affiliates do take general inspiration from them, maybe not guidance in the form of military orders. And I think that anybody who is of a sympathetic view towards al-Qaeda may feel that some sort of reaction to this is called for, if only to demonstrate that the organization is not as weak as an attack in the capital of the Taliban seems to indicate. So I think this is a dangerous time for not just American interests, but for Western interests, which includes South African interests.
And okay, we'll get to that in just a moment, but I just want to understand what we should know really around the strike on Zawahiri. I mean, from the report we had, we understood that President Biden was briefed, but there would have been a counterterrorism strategy that probably would have taken this into account, including what you said, the fact that U.S. assets would be under attack irrespective of wherever they are.
Yeah, strategy is a very misused term in the U.S. government. I think that this is, there's a general policy goal, which is that the perpetrators of terrorist attacks against Americans, and Zawahiri undoubtedly is, at the top of that list, that they cannot be allowed to live their lives in peace and quiet. So that's not really a strategy. That's more of a policy goal. And I think that there were several trade-offs that were discussed. I think one of them was, are we absolutely sure we got the right person? The second one was, are we absolutely sure that we're not going to cause a lot of extraneous damage, kill innocent people, or at least kill people that we don't want to kill, the way that happened most embarrassingly during the drone strike during the evacuation from Kabul last summer. And then I think a secondary one would be, what would be the impact on relations with Afghanistan, which are already pretty bad, and what would be the relationship on U.S. security interests overseas, terrorist threats overseas. But I think that would be a distant third in the hierarchy that was discussed in the White House.
Okay. The question one would ask, if you have insights, please do share them. A, whether or not there were unwanted civilian casualties or people that the United States didn't want killed in this drone attack, but also the fact that al-Qaeda has not really carried out any major attack against the Western target since the 2015 shooting in Paris at the magazine Charlie Hebdo's offices. To my knowledge, if you wish to correct this, please do go ahead. So why now? What threat was he?
Yeah, well, no. So there have been major al-Shabaab and al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb are both affiliates of al-Qaeda. So there have been attacks against Western interests and embassies in Mali, in Mauritania, and in Somalia and Kenya. But yeah, it's true, they are not capable anymore, it appears, of launching large-scale attacks in the West. And even the Charlie Hebdo attacks were not really directed by al-Qaeda, but rather were Ivorian immigrants, I believe, who managed to, were inspired and, took action that way. But it's a far cry from the centralized training and then dispatch overseas that we saw in the 9/11 attack. So there's two questions there. The first question is al-Qaeda still an effective organization, and is the centralized leadership of al-Qaeda effective enough that it warrants this kind of extraordinary action? I think that when Zawahiri was hiding in the hills of Pakistan, so much of al-Qaeda's organizational efforts, power, money, fighting strength had to be devoted to keeping him alive, that you could make a strong case that it's best to keep him on the run, so that al-Qaeda has to put all its effort just in keeping alive rather than conducting attacks. But I think that once he found a comfortable safe haven under the Taliban in Kabul, then the focus shifts from how do you deterring the organization to basically retributive justice. And it was a lot easier to locate him in Kabul than it was in Pakistan. The second issue is what is the nature of al-Qaeda going forward? And I think what we've seen is that the only real effective branches of al-Qaeda now are in Africa. They're in Somalia, they're in the Sahel, particularly in Mali. And what that shows is that the organization has devolved from a centralized model, in large part because of the attacks on it, but also in large part because of al-Zawahiri's leadership. He was not a charismatic leader the way bin Laden was. He was pedantic. He tended to talk down to people. And a lot of people, particularly the leader of al-Qaeda in East Africa, made a point of saying, I don't take orders from this guy. So the organization has basically gone into decline. It's been eclipsed by Daesh, and really its only growth areas are in Somalia and the Sahel.
You mentioned this earlier on, the cooperation between al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Does it still remain very good? Would the Taliban try to ameliorate the situation one way or the other by cooperating, assisting, or is it in their best interest if al-Qaeda is decimated? As you said, there are already fractures.
Yeah, man, you're researchers. My hat's off to them. These are fantastic questions. So last week, the United Nations produced a report on al-Qaeda. So this is the United Nations, not the United States. And it said that the Taliban have been using al-Qaeda throughout the country as sort of the backbone of their fighting and security units in the country. You know, Afghanistan outside of the capital is mostly tribal. And, you know, the Taliban generally are a Pashtun movement. A lot of Afghanistan is not Pashtun. And so they basically have a challenge in administering those areas, particularly given their false, I would argue, interpretation of what Islamic rule means. And so in order to impose their will on unwilling populations, they've been using al-Qaeda to reinforce them. So that would indicate, and that's a United Nations conclusion, that they are unable to disassociate themselves from al-Qaeda, which means that, quite frankly, they, they view the Doha Accords as a dead letter since they've achieved their goal, which is to run Afghanistan. Right?